So one of the really wonderful things about the Steinsaltz Talmud, one of many, is that beginning each chapter and at the end of each chapter, he has a summary. And I wanted to read to you his introduction to the second chapter of Yevamot. This is how it goes. In the first chapter, we discussed women who are prohibited from entering into yibum, levirate marriage, due to their being close relatives of, and therefore severely forbidden to, their yavam, their brother-in-law, together with the rival wives of such women. It was explained that these women are exempt from both yibum, levirate marriage, and chalitza. However, there are other problems that can arise in levirate marriage. Some women are not forbidden to their brother-in-laws with a prohibition of karet. Remember, karet is pre-death by God before your time is up, but are forbidden due to other prohibition, or not by Torah law, but by rabbinic law. In these instances, does the mitzvah of levirate marriage also override the prohibition? Another issue discussed in this chapter is the definition of some fundamental concepts in libum. The Torah states that the brother must perform the levirate marriage, but the question of who exactly is considered a brother requires clarification. The first chapter mentioned the concept of a brother with whom he did not coexist, to whom the halachot of levirate marriage and chalitza do not apply. So let me see if I can bring that up. In Deuteronomy 25, where we read the laws of levirate marriage, it starts with Ki yeshvu achim yachtav, when brothers dwell together. So the halacha, the Mishnah, beginning with the Mishnah already, and then continuing on, if the brother-in-law of the widow is not yet alive when his brother dies, then levirate marriage does not apply. He has to be alive. They have to dwell together. The brothers have to be alive together. In such a case, the exemption from libum is not due to a forbidden union, but rather from the laws of levirate marriage themselves. This chapter defines this concept and clarifies the details and application of this law. Another issue discussed in this chapter is what the Torah means when it uses the term brother. Does it any brother or only the eldest? And does it apply equally to paternal and maternal half-brothers? Must the brother performing yibum be legitimate, or may it be an illegitimate brother? Another topic clarified in this chapter is the term child. Since the Torah uses the masculine word for child, here we have it, uvein ein lo. He doesn't have a son. Uvein ein lo. Does that mean only a son? Or if he has a daughter, is that enough and there is no levirate marriage? How about grandchildren? and other descendants? Does it refer only to legitimate children or also illegitimate children? In cases of doubt as to whether or not there is a surviving child when the brother-in-law dies, is there an obligation to perform yibum and chalitza? These questions are discussed in this chapter. One of the things that I have mentioned before is that on the whole, the Mishnah tends to just go into things. We call it in literary in media res. It starts, it doesn't give you an introduction. It goes right into the subject. And one of the advantages, I call it an advantage, of Rambam, of the Mishnah Torah, is that he starts off giving you the basis of things in a very logical way. In a certain, in a way, I mean, you could say that Steinsaltz is doing the same thing here. It's very helpful, rather than kind of going into things cold, because as we have seen, the Mishnah, it is really not designed as a kind of a logical textbook would be. You wouldn't go into any subject kind of in the middle of things. You start with the basics, and you assume that the person coming in is not well versed and knows all the basics. Nelson.
What if the brother has a child but who dies very young?
The brother has a child. Now wait a minute. Who dies? The brother or
No, the child?
The father?
Well, I was going to say the child dies young, and then he dies subsequently. The father dies.
Oh, so okay, that's a good question. In other words, he did have a son, but the son is now died, and then the father dies.
Yes.
Okay, let's hold it up. We'll see if the Mishnah comes up with that. I'm sure it will. Elliot.
Yeah, I have a question, Rabbi. So here we have the legal situation where a requirement where a brother is obligated to marry the widow of his deceased brother. I wonder, given this situation, could there be I hate to say it, a hope or a lust or desire that his brother dies so he can have his wife?
Oh, I'm sure those things happened. Human nature, I don't think, has changed that much.
But yet among the Aseres Hadibros, one of them is, thou shalt not have lust.
Well, no, the Aseret HaDibrot says thou shalt not commit adultery.
No, covet. Thou shalt not covet.
Yeah, I meant covet.
Okay, you should not covet your neighbor's wife. That is correct.
In this case, it might be a brother, the brother's wife.
Of course, and but it's that particular commandment is a really hard one to enforce, right? How are you going to enforce such a it's good advice, and it's a nice goal to strive for. But obviously, human beings, I would argue, the human nature, where people naturally do covet. People have jealousy of all kinds of things. And that was, I mean, obviously, what we want to do is to control that and to perhaps help people get beyond that. But it's a human nature, and what are we going to do? We're not going to change the nature of human beings.
I think Stephen has a question or a comment.
Yes, Stephen. I'm sorry.
I have a number of comments. Good day, Rabbi.
Yeah.
So, number one, alive. Alive says alive. It doesn't say dwelling with. Alive. So if I take the word alive, whatever the Hebrew is, which is the right way to study, not the English, you can correct me if it says clearly in the Hebrew alive. So that means that
no, it's not a question of alive. It says yachdav, that they yeshvu yachdav, that they are dwelling together.
Oh, okay. So forget the alive. Okay, because I was going to say one that isn't alive, it has and the other is 20 years old, and the other hasn't been born yet. And you'd have to wait till he was 20, so she'd have to become a widow when he's 40 years old for 18-year-old or 38 years old. So that doesn't apply. That reading. The other question is. There's another one about the leveret, the requirements. It was, oh no, boy, I'll have to come back to it when I remember.
That's all right. That's okay.
Yeah, I'll raise my hand again. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and see it. Okay. Let's go back now to so we're gonna, let's see if I stop this.
Brother.
Yes.
Brother means brother, and to me, whether it's the same mother, the same and father, or one parent is common to both of them, it doesn't matter. There's no such determination to me in logic of half brothers. Stepbrother is different. A stepbrother is not a brother. It's a term used for someone that is in a union of two parents, and each had their own children, and there's no blood relationship. So there's but a half brother is the same as a brother when the word brother is used.
Well, we're going to see. They're going to discuss this. So it's not. It's not obvious at the beginning, so they're going to discuss this, and we'll see that this becomes somewhat of an issue, but they'll discuss it. So let's hold that. So now the Mishnah, the second chapter begins, and let's start with the translation. You see it, yes?
No.
The translation gives us an introduction.
It's not shared right now.
It's not shared. I'm sorry. Okay, let me go back here. Share. Okay, here. Now it's shared. Yes?
No.
It says started.
There, now it's there. Good.
Is it shared?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And you hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous. Okay. So our translation doesn't go right into the text. It gives us a little bit of an explanation. Each of the women enumerated in the first chapter causes exemption from Yibum and Chalitza, not only for that woman who is related to the brother-in-law and therefore forbidden, but also for her rival wives. This is due, that is, the woman's exemption is due to the close family relationship she has with her brother-in-law, making her forbidden to him. The single exception is the case explained in this Mishnah. So, what is the case? Ketzad eshet achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. What is the case for the wife of a brother? The brother dies, and his brother did not yet exist. Lo haya ba'olamo. He was not in his world. He was not in the world when his brother was alive. So here he goes and explains it. Shnei achim, two brothers, umet echad mehem, and one of them died. So my commentary, and this is typical, I think I've mentioned this, talks about Shimon and Reuven. Shimon and Reuven are brothers. Shimon dies. Reuven then is obligated to marry his widow since he has no son, or we'll say child. We'll discuss this coming up. And then b'achar kach yibem hasheni et eshet achiv. And Shimon died. Reuven then marries his widow, but vamet, Reuven dies. No children. So now the commentary adds a little something that isn't in the explicit in the text. Case of the wife of a brother with whom he did not exist. Two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. One of them died. Shimon died childless. Okay, again, the text doesn't say childless, but obviously that is what we're talking about. Otherwise, there's no such thing as levirate marriage. Subsequently, then Yehuda, a brother of Shimon and Reuven, is born. Then Reuven, who married his brother Shimon's widow, dies. That is, after which the second brother, the older one, he took his deceased brothers in levirate marriage and then died. Reuven now died. Shimon died, Reuven died, but Yehuda is still alive. Consequently, two women require levirate marriage. The widow of the first brother, who had been taken in levirate marriage by the second brother, and the widow of the second brother, who was the first widow's rival wife. The first widow, okay, the first one is not required to. That is, the brother-in-law is not required to marry that first widow because he was not yet alive. He did not coexist. The first deceased brother never lived at the same time as his newly born brother. The second widow, who had been married to the second brother, in other words, Shimon died, Reuven had a wife, but married also Shimon's widow. Now, since Shimon's widow is now exempt from marrying the third brother, because the third brother wasn't alive when her husband died, then both the wives of Reuven married Shimon's widow, but already had a wife. Both wives do not require, and in fact are exempt, both from Yibum and Chalitza, because Yehuda, the baby brother, wasn't around when Shimon, well, whoever I said, when the first brother died. If, however, there's another situation. How about if, let's go back to the Hebrew, Asa va ma'amar vamet. What happens if here we go. Mishnah discusses an additional situation. If the second brother had performed only levirate betrothal, ma'amar. Ma'amar comes from the root aleph mem resh, and it means he said that he was going to get married, but the marriage was not yet consummated. There was a betrothal, a rusin, but there was not yet nisuin. We'll talk much more about this as we go further, but I hope you all know that a marriage ceremony today has two parts. First part, that's why we have 2 cups of wine. The first part is known as a rusin, and the first cup of wine is drunk after the birchot erusin, and the second half of the ceremony is nisuin. And originally, and that's what we're talking about here in the time of the Mishnah, there was a period usually of a year between erusin and nisuin. What happened was that the rabbis already decided that this was a very dangerous idea. Why? Because erusin was a formal enough ceremony that if the woman had a sexual relationship with someone else other than the one for who had betrothed her, for who was prepared to marry her, that was considered adultery. The punishment for adultery is death, and very, very serious. And so the rabbis decided, let's not do a year between these ceremonies. Let's do them together. And so the erusin, what we're talking about with ma'amar here, is erusin was done, but not nisuin. What happens then is the second brother had performed only betrothal. He hadn't yet finished the process. In other words, he's kind of half married. He's not fully married. and he dies. What happens then? Both the wife betrothed by a levirate betrothal to the second brother and the wife of the second brother before the youngest brother was born after the death of the first brother. In that case, the first wife certainly goes out, it says. If you look at the Hebrew, Harishona Yotzeit. Goes out. That is not required to have yibum or chalitza, and is exempt from both chalitza and yibum, since she is to him the wife of a brother with whom he did not coexist. However, the second was never effectively the rival wife of the first brother's wife, as the first brother's wife had only been betrothed and it wasn't a full marriage. And therefore, there is chalitza, but not yibum. What we have seen, and we saw this once before, is that if it isn't a full marriage, then the yibum is not done. Oh, then only chalitza, not yibum. But there has to be chalitza because it's kind of a half marriage. It's not a full marriage. If it's a full marriage, then we deal both with yibum and chalitza. But if there's some question with regard to the marriage, then there has to be a ceremony, but it has to be chalitza and not yibum. Yes, Elliot.
I wonder, in terms of a case where someone marries his brother's widow, so ultimately, would that marriage be on the same level of holiness as the original marriage?
Absolutely.
And I wonder what happens later on. Maybe you'll be getting to it at a later point about divorces and gets and so forth. Would there be a difference in getting a get if in fact it is one of these marriages compared to an original one?
No, full marriage. No. It would be a full marriage. Full marriage. No difference. Once the yibum takes place, it's a full marriage, and therefore everything applies, just as if one were married.
The same.
No difference. Other questions? Yes, Karen.
So if I got this straight, and I don't know what names I'm going to use. So Shmuel is married to a woman, and Yehuda is already alive.
Okay.
Okay, and Shmuel, dies. Shmuel dies.
Okay.
So, and Yehuda is married to somebody else too. So he has to do yibum with Shmuel's wife.
Yes.
So
and now he has two wives.
Now he has two wives. But then Chayav is born.
Okay.
After Shmuel dies, but Yehuda is still alive. So Chaim is obligated, he's not obligated to marry Yehuda's wife because she's a sister wife or whatever they call it. But isn't he obligated to marry? He's not obligated to marry Shmuel's wife because he didn't live at the same time as Shmuel.
That's right.
But then isn't he obligated to marry Yehuda's wife?
No, because she's a rival wife. She's a tzara.
Okay.
See, once the second brother marries his brother's widow,
Okay.
then they are rival wives. So if one is free, the other is free.
All right, so if Chaim had only done chalitza, if he'd only been betrothed to Yehuda's wife, to Shmuel's wife, if he hadn't finished marrying her, then he wasn't really married to her. So isn't the Chaim then obligated because she wasn't really a rival wife?
Oh, we're going to come to that.
Okay.
We're going to come to that about
Right.
with that. But let's assume the first Mishnah deals with the problem, the issue of a brother who wasn't yet born when his brother dies. Since he was not born, the law is no levirate marriage, no chalitza. Okay. Second point that is here. Let's see if I can share this again. Share. Yes. Share. Second point is Asava ma'amar vamet. In the second case now, the brother didn't fully marry his brother's widow. He half married her. Then chalitza is required. The second was never fully married. It says effectively the rival wife of the first brother's wife. So if there wasn't a full marriage, then the rival wife was not really a full rival wife, and therefore the rival wife can only there must be chalitza because it's kind of a half marriage. And so she's almost a hot rival wife, but she's not fully a rival wife, and therefore yibum does not take place. Okay, next Mishnah. Two brothers, Shimon and Reuven. Umet echad mehem. Shimon dies. V'yibem hasheni et eshet achiv. And Shimon dies, Reuven marries Shimon's widow. And while he's now, this is important to recognize, our translation adds something that isn't explicit, but you have to understand that it's there. That is, Reuven had a wife already before he married Shimon's widow. He was already married to another woman. And v'charkach, and then afterwards, they had, the brothers had another brother born. Okay, v'charkach nolad lahem ach. And now the second brother also dies. Shimon died, and now Reuven died. Reuven had a wife and then married his brother's wife, and without children, he dies, and Shimon had died, now Reuven dies, whereby both of his wives happened before the third brother for levirate marriage. So then the first one, that is the wife of Reuven, the first brother who died, is not obligated to marry this newborn brother because he wasn't alive when her husband died. And the other wife is not obligated because she is a rival wife now. So both of them are not required, have no yibum and no chalitza. Let's look at the Hebrew. Two brothers, Shimon and Levi. Umet echad mehem. And Shimon dies. V'yibem hasheni, and Reuven marries his widow, Shimon's widow. And then they have a brother, Yosef. And now Reuven dies, Vamet. Shimon's wife is freed from Yibum and Chalitza from Yosef because he wasn't alive when Shimon died. Shelo haya ba'olamo. And the first wife of Reuven also doesn't have Yibum or Chalitza with Yosef because she is a rival wife now of her sister-in-law. Now, Asaba Ma'amar, there we go again. How about if the second brother, that is Reuven, had only done erusin with his brother-in-law, his brother's widow, and dies before they have any children, and before he fully marries her, then again, it's only a partial marriage, so chalitza is required, but yibum is not allowed, as the levirate betrothal is not considered a sufficiently valid marriage. And therefore, only chalitza must be done. Now we have a alternate opinion, a contrasting opinion. Rabbi Shimon says, in such a case, now which case? So it's not explicit, but our translation says, with regard to the first clause of the Mishnah, he says, Rabbi Shimon says, the third brother, Yosef, can, according to Rabbi Shimon, can have a levirate marriage with whichever wife he wants to, or he can perform chalitza with whichever one he wants to. Since he was born after his second brother had already entered into levirate marriage with the first brother's widow, she's considered the wife of a brother with whom he did coexist, not the wife of a brother with whom he did not coexist. Therefore, he may marry either one. So, Rabbi Shimon here is disagreeing with the Tanakama and is saying, well, the first brother died before Yosef was born, but he was born and the second brother was alive, and therefore he allows this marriage. See how complicated it gets.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, Elliot.
I wonder, yes, it certainly is complicated. I guess it's a mind-sharpening exercise to think
Yes,
about all of
one
these
can argue that.
relationships. But what I wonder about was, in particular, wonder, are there are there any texts that describe the relationships among the rival wives who could see each other somehow in competition with each other or not? I just wonder how these laws affect the relationships that these people had.
Well, we know from Rachel and Leah from Genesis already, of the rivalries. We know it from Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah, the mother of Saul, of King Saul, who had no children, and Peninnah had many children, and her husband says, "Oh, but I love you more than I love her," but that doesn't satisfy Hannah. She wants a son, and there's rivalry among them. So obviously this is a human characteristic, and it must have been disastrous in many cases. I never watched it, but I know there's a program on television, or at least there was a program on television about a Mormon couple with multiple wives. And I suspect it's quite a soap opera with the tensions between them. There must have been terrible stories. I suppose also some cases where things worked out. But I don't believe human nature has changed.
Rabbi, I suspect that everybody online probably knows examples of families who are biologically closely connected, but they don't speak to each other. It would seem to me back in these days that we're talking about in the Talmud, it would become vastly more complex, and there would be all kinds of relationship impairments.
I'm sure. Whether things are better or worse, I can't tell you. I think one of the big differences today is that people move a lot. So families tend not to live next to each other. And I think in earlier times, families tended to live in closer proximity, which probably made things worse. But I don't know. They could have been better or worse. I know, one of my fondest memories growing up was the extended family. My grandparents were first cousins, my mother's parents, and they each had 6 siblings. And so we had a gigantic apple family, and we would have these darim with 100 and some people in a hotel. And we would have these Hanukkah parties and Purim parties. And it was fabulous growing up with this extended family where I knew all my aunts and my great aunts and my cousins. And the same thing on my father's family. He was one of 6, and we would gather for Hanukkah at my grandmother's house, and there would be 50 people there, and all my cousins were there, and my aunts and uncles were there, and it was fabulous. And I think today, with mobility, people to have grandchildren in the place where the grandparents live I'm so delighted that I have 3 here with me. 2 are, in Israel, but but I think it's relatively rare for people to have all their grandchildren together, and especially and cousins and aunts and uncles. So I think growing up, and I think that was more typical in earlier generations, was you had the extended family, and with all that comes, it can be very enriching, and it can be, I'm sure, very filled with tension and bad feelings and so forth. I would always say, and I would always regret when I would hear of families where people didn't talk to each other. And I would always argue that Chodesh Elul, the month before Rosh Hashanah, that's the time to repair relationships. And families should take that time to kind of find a way to build a relationship. If we can't get along with each other, even in a family, how are we going to bring peace to the world? I used to say that about rabbis and cantors. We've been very lucky at B'nai Yeshurun that Cantor Schiffman and the rabbis have been a real wonderful team. But that's not necessarily typical. If cantors and rabbis can't get along, how are we going to make peace in the world? But Elul is a time for repairing relationships, and we have it every year. So I really feel strongly that when families don't get along, it's really unforgivable. But you're right, Elliot, that with plural marriage, it's only going to make things more complicated.
I've seen over the many years I've taught English as a second language at Tri-C, how there seems to be less of an emotional connection among those families that come here with their parents and grandparents and so forth. And sometimes I've heard, well, I'm an American now. We don't have to live in a house with an in-law suite and so forth. So they become acculturated, and when they change cultures, they adopt some of the values and ideas of the new culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's obviously what happened with our ancestors when they came to this country. In many cases, and there's a lot of literature about this, some of it in Yiddish. And in fact, our Yiddish group has read a couple of these stories of the conflicts that the old world immigrants and their children or born here or came as young children. These kinds of conflicts are quite common. One of in fact, Gina and I were just talking about this a couple of weeks ago, about how our Israeli-born grandchildren feel about their parents, who were not.
Mr. Lettofsky,
yes.
Your wife is finished and she was looking for you.
Could you bring her here?
Well, she's in the restroom right now,
Okay.
but I will.
Tell her. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. We were just talking the other day about what they think of their parents. It's a real interesting and I would argue universal phenomenon of I mean, I know it with Jean. Her parents were born in Germany. She was born in New York. And as a child of immigrants, she had all of these issues. They didn't understand me. They didn't understand the culture. They didn't appreciate the difficulties I was facing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's quite common. Okay,
So shouldn't children be taught from day one that the Zakanim, the older people, while they may not have the university degrees, they have a certain sensitivity and knowledge about life that the younger people may not have, may not get in their secular education?
one of my favorite jokes when I was in Hillel was that when kids came home for Thanksgiving after their first freshman year, their parents grew up a lot in that period. All of a sudden, after living away from home on their own, when they came back, they realized, oh my God, my parents really are much smarter than I thought and much more capable than I thought. And the mother's food is so much better than I thought. And so much more is so much better than I thought.
Rabbi, just one more
Yes.
quick comment. I remember my mother, who encouraged me to get an education. She was college educated, although she was born in Russia and grew up in New York. She said, son, what's all this college stuff about? You come home, you have Thanksgiving, you vacation, then you go back, then you go home for December break, and then you have spring break. How many hours a year are you in class?
Yeah, we were, the expectation of having a long winter break and a spring break and an even longer summer break. When you get out of school and you go back and you go to work, then you realize what life is really like. But the wonderful thing about being young is you're innocent. So it's okay. Are you seeing the Mishnah now? Do you see it? Are you? No.
Yes.
Yes.
You're just
Okay.
going to, okay.
Third Mishnah starts very hopefully, I think, because it starts with the word klal. There is a principle, a klal, a general rule that the rabbis, that the sages had, a klal amru vayevama, a general principle with regard to levirate marriage. Kol shehi isur erva lo choletzet velo mityabenet. A woman who is forbidden to her brother-in-law because of erva. Erva, you will recall, in the laws of in Vayikra, which we read on Yom Kippur in Mincha. It says in verse 6, none of you shall come near anyone of his own flesh, and it legalot erva. Erva is translated here to uncover nakedness. The laws of incest are hilchot erva or arayot, the plural arayot. So the Mishnah here in talking about this is what we've about. what we've been dealing with from the beginning of the Mishnah is a Mishnah Arayot is this problem of relationship, of family relationship, which would not allow the brother-in-law to marry the widow of his brother. But there are other, where I do things. Oh, I don't want to. Here we go. Oh, wait, wrong one. Stop share. I'm still learning how to do it with this damn thing. Come on.
It was up a minute ago.
Yeah. Okay, it will be up again eventually, I guess. I don't know. I'll learn eventually, I suppose, but it may take a couple of years. Okay. Share application. Here we go. No. Here.
It was there and it just disappeared.
Here, I want to do this one, I thought.
Okay,
Get it wrong.
Coming?
it's coming. Wait, yeah, it's there.
It's there underneath what I want to
Oh,
do.
I'm seeing it in the full screen.
Here, now you see it?
Yep,
Mishnah Yavamot.
2,
Okay.
3. Yeah.
2, 3.
Okay. So Isur Erva. But there are other reasons not to allow that come into play with regard to Yibum and Chalitza. All that we've looked at so far is relationships, that is family relationships that would involve incest. Then it goes on, and we see lo choletzet v'lo mityabemet, no chalitza and no yibum. Okay, but there are other reasons, other factors that apply. If she is forbidden by a prohibition related to a mitzvah, isur mitzvah, isur kedusha, or a prohibition based on sanctity, on holiness, then there is only chalitza and not yibum. And then our translation adds, the sages stated another principle. If two sisters had been married to two brothers and they both died, and it happened before the third brother for a levirate marriage, and one of those sisters is a close relation to the third brother and is therefore forbidden to him, she is exempt from levirate marriage. But the other one, her sister who is her sister-in-law, that is her sister-in-law, performs chalitza and enters into levirate marriage. In this case, they are not ruled to be sisters who happen before him simultaneously for levirate marriage, since one of them is prohibited to him as a forbidden relationship, and therefore she never actually happened before him at all. This looks on the surface to be quite simple, and it isn't. So we don't know what it means by Isur Mitzvah, nor do we know what it means by Isur Kedusha. And this last thing sounds really odd. Sisters married to brothers, and the chalitza, yes, but not yibum. So next time we will come to explain what Isur Mitzvah is and what Isur Kedusha is, and then we'll go into this other complicated one. Okay? Everybody have a good week. And Karen, enjoy.
Thank you.
Especially for me. Enjoy.
Okay.
Take care.
Great, thank you. Everybody be well.
Be well.
Yes.